Before I begin, I just want to point out two things. You will get copies of the slides. Okay, so you can take photos if you want, but just know that you'll have a hard copy at the end of the day. And second, I normally deliver this speech in 1 hour, and they've asked me to compress it to 30 minutes. Okay, so, but if you want the slow-mo version, you can invite us to your office. Myself or one of my staff can give you the fully expanded version. Okay. I'd like to begin this talk by reminding you about a Bible story. It comes from the Old Testament, so this is probably in the Quran as well. It's when God comes and asks Adam and Eve, why are you wearing clothes? Who told you that you were naked? And what's the answer, right? Because they had eaten from the fruit of the forbidden tree. And so they were hiding because they were guilty. And in many ways, this has shaped our thoughts about privacy. If I'm hiding something, then I must be guilty. And if I'm innocent, well then, everything is available because I don't have anything to hide. And so we have to ask ourselves, is this still valid in the data-driven economy? We have to ask ourselves, what is more valuable, data or money? If someone takes your money, that's all they have. They have your money. But if someone takes your data, pretty soon, they may have your money as well. And this was illustrated by this sad story about a public school teacher who found out suddenly that he had 800,000 pesos in bank loans when he had not actually opened any of these loans. But what he had done was he had posted his PRC ID online. And from that data, identity thieves were able to open those 3 loans. In fact, identity thieves can do a lot more. They can open credit card accounts, apply for a tax refund, use your medical benefits without you knowing it. And what happens to you? You lose those benefits, or you have to recover those assets, or you have to file a lawsuit. And of course, stress and embarrassment can also happen to you. In fact, cybercrime has become such a big industry that organized crime has already gotten into it. In 2015, it was reported that the cost was $126 billion, and 689 people were affected. And I think if we look at the 2016 numbers, this will only go up. But this is not to say that it's only criminals that can turn data into money. Right? Companies can do it as well. And this is called data monetization. And here are 3 examples. Uber takes 3 pieces of data. Right? If you don't have Uber on your phones yet and you download it, it will only ask you for 3 pieces of data. Where you are now, where you're going, and how much you're willing to pay. And with those 3 pieces of data, they've created the world's largest transportation company without even owning any single vehicle. Airbnb also gets 3 pieces of data from you, where you want to go, how long you want to stay, and how much you're willing to pay. And they've created the world's largest hotel company without even owning a single room. And Facebook only needs 2 pieces of data, who your friends are and what you like. And they've created the world's largest media company, taking eyeballs away from newspapers and televisions. And those eyeballs, of course, bring advertising bucks and advertising revenue to Facebook. So they're the world's largest media company, and yet they do not own a single printing press or a production studio. So that's what data monetization is all about. And I like this quote from this guy, that's me actually, which says that in today's environment where competitors can copy your products, pirate your employees, and mirror your algorithms, data is the only sustainable competitive advantage. Right? Because Grab Taxi can copy what Uber is doing. Lyft can pirate away the employees of Uber. But it's Uber's data that allows them to offer products like Uber Hop and Uber Pool, because they know where all those trips are, and they can set a price point where they can then monetize that data. And maybe that's why people are now saying that data is actually the new oil of the digital economy. If you have that data, you can become as wealthy as the oil barons of the past. But I don't want to leave you the impression that it's only corporations and criminals that are profiting from data, because society profits as well, right? Data is being used to tackle society's largest problems, like poverty reduction and disease eradication. And I really like the story from the Manila Bulletin, in fact, just last year, where he says that Barangay Bunuan Bukig in Dagupan was able to defeat dengue, and not by having a lot of medicines and vaccinations. It was big data that allowed them to identify, where the mosquitoes were gathering and then use that to eradicate dengue. So this is what society's goal is now in this digital age. Right? We want to use that information. We want to use that big data because it leads to innovation and growth. But we also want to protect these basic rights which define what it means to be human. And privacy is one of those rights. And that's why I'm so proud that we now have this landmark legislation on the books of our country, Republic Act 10-173, which begins with this. It is the policy of the state to protect the fundamental human right of privacy, of communication, while ensuring the free flow of information to promote innovation and growth. It's very powerful. And the interesting thing to observe is that the world is now splitting up into two. The part of the world that agrees with this fundamental human right to privacy and the part of the world that doesn't. And in Europe, it began in the 1980s with what they call the DPD, or the Data Protection Directive, which is now going to be updated in 2018 to the GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulations. So Europe is definitely on that side. Right? We have now followed, our law is based upon those directives. But there are some countries that say, yes, we respect this right, but they actually do not. And the United States was one of those. Now, as we saw with the Snowden revelations, there's a lot of surveillance going on. And this was discovered around 2012. And eventually, the Europeans realized the hypocrisy of the Americans. And they said, you say that you respect our data, but you don't. You do not protect our citizens' data. And so a European court in 2015 ruled that this transatlantic pact, used by thousands of companies to transfer Europeans' personal information to the US, violated privacy. And they struck down this agreement called the Safe Harbor Agreement, which has now been replaced by the Privacy Shield, but it's still also being questioned in the courts. So this is really saying that in order for us to transact, in order for us to have a relationship, we have to trust you. And in today's data-driven economy, privacy has become the proxy for trust. If you breach my privacy, then you lose my trust. If you lose my trust, then you lose my business. You lose my relationship. And this is true not just between nations, but between governments and the citizens of that government, of that nation, between businesses, as well as between the consumer and that business. Now, as Dr. Yu was saying earlier, if you give your data to this phone company, you don't want to see your privacy breached by suddenly having some credit card companies come and pester you with applications. Right? If you lose my trust, you lose my business. And so I'm glad that we have the Data Privacy Act, which now brings us into the age of privacy. Again, it's Republic Act 10173. This is what the structure of that act looks like. It's a bit hard to read, but sometimes I suggest you just go straight to Section 11, because this is where we talk about the rights of the data subjects. And all of us here are data subjects, you and me, right? Because we give our data to these other companies called personal information controllers and processors. And this 11 to 21 also describes their obligations, what they have to do so that our rights are preserved. Those rights that Dr. Yu again, talked to us about earlier, right? So the rights versus obligations, and they have to balance each other out. Then as you're reading Section 11 to 21, you might come across some terms like personal information, sensitive personal information. What does this mean? Then you can go back to Section 3 where the definitions are. And then at some point you might want to see what's this thing called the National Privacy Commission that's supposed to make this act work, and that's in Section 7 to 10. And if you work for government, or if you give your data to government agency like COMELEC or SSS, you might want to read sections 22 to 24, because government is the largest collector of data in the country. And so there are some specific provisions in the law that are directed towards government agencies. And what happens if your rights are violated? Well, we have penalties. We can put people in jail and we can fine them. And that's, probably the most interesting part that will wake you up, because then you'll realize really how many how we can actually punish violations. Again, the rights of the data subject have already been mentioned by Dr. Yu. Right? If you feel that your rights have been violated, and remember, this act was signed in 2012. So even if you remember something that's 3, 4, 5 years old, you can still bring a complaint. Keep calm, because someone is there to fight for you. Okay, keep calm and complain if you feel that your data was collected in a way that was not transparent or proportional. Keep calm if you feel that someone tampered with your personal data without your knowledge. Or if you suffered harm as a result of a personal data breach, we're there to help you. Of course, as data subjects, we also expect you to practice good cyber hygiene habits. Right? How many of you know what that thing in the picture is? Hand sanitizer, right? When you were a kid, did you have hand sanitizers? No. In fact, if your food fell on the ground, you just pick it up and say, 1, 2, okay. Right? But because of MERS, because of AIDS, because of bird flu, our hygiene habits changed, right? And we now have our own hand sanitizer, or when we enter a hospital, we use those sanitizers beside the elevator, beside the door, and so on. So we can change our habits, and one of the habits we have to change is these things, being vigilant when it comes to personal data. Thinking before you click, following strict password hygiene, and so on. Right? These are things that we now have to start inculcating. And just like the example of the hand sanitizers, right, it costs money, right, to install those hand sanitizers. Hospitals have to spend millions to install them, and they're also spending millions to continue to keep them filled. Right? This is because this is now the other side of the equation, the obligation to make sure that these things happen. And in our law, that obligation is carried by two, the PICs, or the Personal Information Controllers, and the PIPs, or the Personal Information Processors. So can I see, how many of you here in this room belong to the PICs? You collect data. Okay. How about here? Right? Actually, most of you are, because if you have employees in your organization, you collect data about your employees. Right? So that also makes you a PIC. And how many here are the PIPs, the vendors? Or if you provide shared services, anyone? Okay, obviously, yes, our host today, MDI, is a perfect example of a PIP. Right? And the Data Privacy Act now says that in order to respect those rights, there are certain obligations that you must comply with. That's why you have to read the Data Privacy Act of 2012, especially if you're collecting data about your customers, about your clients, about your constituents, about your employees. But not only that, you also have to read the IRR, right? Because the Act itself, sometimes there's just one sentence that says you have to notify data subjects in case of a breach, right? Because that's one of the rights of a data subject. I want to know if my privacy shield has been lowered. Is it 10%, 20%? So that I can rebuild my shield. And so you have to notify me. And in the Data Privacy Act of 2012, it's just one sentence. In the IRR, we've now added a whole section on what that breach notification means. What should be contained in the notification, how soon it must be done, and we said 72 hours, and how it is to be done. So please read the IRRs as well. And it's not only that you have to comply with, because the NPC continues to issue circulars on a regular basis, because we also have to modernize the legislation, right? When it was written back in 2012, passed in 2012, we didn't really know about the cloud. Now that we know about the cloud, we can then address it in certain circulars. So Circular 1 is addressed to government agencies. Circular 2 talks about how you share data between organizations. Circular 3 is 10 pages on breach management, because breaches, you cannot report a breach if you do not have the management processes to report that breach. So Circular 3 talks about how do you form a team? How do you get together? How do you get ready so that when the breach happens, you can notify within 72 hours? And Circular 4 talks about the rules for filing a complaint, for handling a complaint, for handling an appeal in case we give you an order to do something. We will be coming up with more circulars as well in 2017. We're planning to have one together with the Banco Central for the companies that they supervise. We're also working with the Department of Health for the clinics, the hospitals, the professionals that they regulate, as well as other sectors such as outsourcing, retail, real estate, and so on. So these are the things that you need to read in order to comply. And what happens if you don't comply? This is where the National Privacy Commission, as the regulator, comes in. One of the things that we can do is, as I said, we receive complaints, we then investigate, and we ask you to resolve this through a dispute resolution process or arbitration. But if that doesn't happen, then we can actually adjudicate, and we can say, you have to pay the data subject this much. So we're actually a quasi-judicial body. We can award indemnity on matters affecting any personal information. But it's not just the cash that you would lose. You could also lose your reputation, right? Because we're also allowed to publicize any such report or investigation if we feel that there's a lesson to be learned and it's something that can impact the privacy ecosystem. Another thing we can do is we can come to you and say, stop what you're doing. We can impose a temporary or permanent ban on the processing of personal information if you find that that processing is detrimental to national security and public interest. And finally, we can compel you to take action on any matter affecting data privacy. Right? We can say, hey, you have to change that form that you're using. Or hey, you have to put up a call center to handle complaints and investigations because of that data breach that happened to you last year. So these are the things that can happen if you find yourself not complying. And you personally could be affected because Section 22 says if you're the head of a government agency, you're responsible. But it's not only government agencies that we could find responsible. It's also any corporation, partnership, or juridical person where the penalty shall be imposed upon the officers who participated in or by their gross negligence allowed the commission of the crime. So if we find that you were negligent in coming up with the ways to comply with the act, you could be found guilty of gross negligence. And by the way, what are these penalties and crimes? I think this is a good point to bring you the punishable acts and the jail terms and the fines. All right, what happens, for example, if you're a hospital and you dispose of patient records improperly, you just put them into a trash can. Well, that's already improper disposal, right? And what happens then if we find out it was because the officers of that hospital never put in place the proper procedures to dispose of that information? Then it was not just the person that improperly disposed of it, but the officers who could also be found negligent. And that could be true for any of these illegal acts as well. But of course, our goal is not to put people in jail. Our goal is to build this culture of privacy. And that's why I'm here to tell you how to stay out of jail. Okay? Which is basically 5 legal obligations. I'm going to go through each obligation very quickly. But as I said, if you want more details, we can arrange separate sessions in the future. You can come to our office. We can explain this in more detail. First one, appoint a data privacy officer or a compliance officer. And the legal basis for this is, of course, there on the screen. Again, it will be on your handout, so you can refer to this Section 21, Section 50 of the IRR, and Circular 16-01. This is what compliance will look like. You appoint or you designate a data protection officer, you have it notarized, and then you file it with us. So we know exactly what date it was that you did that designation. Of course, it's not enough to appoint someone. We have to see that when you appoint someone, those recommendations that that person makes are listened to by top management and not just placed on the shelf somewhere. And of course, the contact details of that person are on the website. And your company sends your DPO to a continuing education program. Because you can't just appoint someone and say, that's it. You're never going to grow in that career, right? Negligence looks like this. If the DPO sends memos and they're not responded to, they're ignored. If data subjects come to your DPO to complain, and then 2 weeks later comes to us in the National Privacy Commission and says, we complained to the DPO, but nothing happened. And if we see that happening over and over again, and we see this non-reporting happening, that can be negligence, right? One of these things is not negligence, but gross negligence, yeah, if there will be several of these, right? How should you select the DPO? Of course, it has to be someone with the knowledge of privacy and data protection. But it should also be someone that within the organizational structure can empower change. Because sometimes the things that the DPO will recommend require change to be done within 24 hours or within a week. And you can only do that if you have that level of empowerment within the organization. Sometimes this means that you have to have a full-time DPO. And sometimes the DPO actually has to be supported by an office or an assistant. How do you decide? Take a risk assessment. No, because it really determines whether you're low risk or medium risk or high risk. And what I've given in your handouts is a 20-page, 20 questions. 20 questions that you simply answer true, false, or you don't know. And if your score is 0 to 40, then you're low risk. Maybe you can already pass with a part-time DPO. But if your score is within 41 to 70, then you're medium risk. And you should really think about having a full-time DPO. And if you are high risk, your score was 71 or more, you probably should have one or more than one DPO, maybe an assistant DPO, maybe a task force, maybe an entire data protection office. I know that there's a bank that's attending, for example, that's already forming an office for data protection. Essentially, the risk assessment goes like this. If you're not processing personal data, if you're only open less than 8 hours a day, if all your storage is non-digital, it's all paper, then it's very easy to secure that and to watch it. So yes, you're low risk. If you're all digital, and you have less than 1,000 records, then you're medium risk. But if you have both digital and paper, you have to have 2 types of access controls. If you have 250 or more users, then a lot of people have the password, right? If you're sharing your data with external parties, then you have to have data sharing agreements in place. So I know some of you will be all over this and just have to score yourselves. The interesting thing about that scoring assessment is that we've done it with companies, and sometimes in one company, one group will say, oh, we're low risk. Another group will say, oh, we're high risk. And that's a good place to dialogue. Find out what your differences are. Why do they think you're low risk? And why does that other person think you're high risk? And maybe you'll be able to find out what your real risk level is. Now, as I said earlier, I won't be able to cover these slides of what a DPO does, but this will be in your handouts. What the DPO should deliver, what the DPO needs to build capacity, and more importantly, how does the DPO work with the rest of the organization, including process owners, HR, legal, IT, and of course, from top management. Let me go on to the second legal obligation. Process data with transparency, legitimate purpose, and proportionality. Right? And what does this mean? What does compliance look like? If you go in and we see that you have policies about how you process data called privacy policies, and that these policies are cascaded throughout the organization. If we see that the people who actually handle the data have a security clearance that's signed by top management, and in order to get the security clearance, they've been through training to orient them on what they're actually handling, that what they're handling is actually more valuable than money. Right? Privacy notices posted where appropriate, for example, on your website. Data sharing agreements in place. You have to have something called the privacy impact assessment, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. And you have to have service providers that comply. So MDI, because MDI is the service provider in the room, that means you now have to start revising your service level agreements and contracts to adhere to the Data Privacy Act. What does negligence look like? You have a privacy policy, but it's just on the shelf and nobody knows what it is when we ask the security guard about it. Let's say you have a security guard with a logbook in the entrance of your building and we ask him, do you know what you're handling? What's the privacy policy for that? And he says, I don't know. Where do you keep that logbook at the end of the day? Under lock and key? Okay. So that's what negligence would look like. no privacy notice or over collection, having data sharing without any agreements, and your compliance obligations are not passed on to your service providers. So essentially, this means that for many of you, you'll have to renegotiate those service level agreements or contracts with your current providers. These are the principles that we talk about. And just to give you a little bit of example, right? Transparency, no surprise in the way the data is being collected, legitimate purpose because it's required by law, and it's proportionate to what's needed and the benefits. For example, COMELEC. In the COMELEC registration form, it asks, what handicap do you have? So there's no surprise because they're collecting that data. So if it shows up on the website, you know that you consented to putting that data in. Is it legitimate? Yes, because they're supposed to register voters and give as many voters a chance to vote, even if you're visually impaired, even if you're not able to, even if you're in a wheelchair, we want you to vote. And that's the legal purpose of collecting voter registration. Is it proportional to the benefits? Yes. Because if COMELEC knows that you're in a wheelchair, they will not assign you to a precinct on the 4th floor. They'll make sure you're assigned to a precinct on the 1st floor. If you're visually impaired, they'll even provide you with someone who can read the ballot to you, right, and then shade all those circles. Right? So that's how you would adhere to these principles. Okay. The next step, however, is to do something called a privacy impact assessment, or a PIA. And this is what it would look like. You list down all the processes in your organization. So in this organization, they have 4 processes. And then you now assess the privacy risk. What is the risk if this information gets out into the wild? And you can adjust that risk for severity, how big a damage would be caused, for likelihood, what's the probability of it happening, and for magnitude, how many people are going to be affected. And so you can now say, like, this organization has 1 high, 1 low, and 2 medium risk processes. You would then list down what are the benefits. If we did this process, we could have more voters, right? We could really have the pulse of the people. But then you now have to say, what are the controls? How do we control access to that data? How do we secure that data? Is it going to be very expensive and high cost to control that data? Then maybe the assessment is that it's unreasonable. So for process 1 and process 2, the DPO would say, let's not perform those processes until we have a better way to control the data, until we have increased the benefits that will result from having that process. But process 3 and process 4, the risks are commensurate to the benefits, therefore we can conduct that. We can perform that process. So this is what a PIA would look like. When do you conduct it? Again, anytime you're initiating a new business process or a new technology, anytime you want to enter a data sharing agreement. And here's something I'd like to add that's not on the slide. Anytime you're using data that you collected 2 or 3 years ago, right? Because, good point that the Dr. Yu brought out, the accuracy has to be there. You don't want to be using a database that's 2 to 3 years old and sending notices to people who have already passed away, for example. Right? It's very insensitive. Third legal obligation is you have to protect that data. And a nice acronym here is CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And what does this look like? You have identified the risks to the data, you have put the appropriate controls in place, you do frequent monitoring and vulnerability scanning, you conduct regular drills, and your service providers are in compliance. What negligence would look like? You just put up a generic control framework and say, yeah, we're doing all of this. Okay. You have lax hybrid hygiene practices. We walk around and we see that everyone has a password that's 40 characters long, but it's on a post-it and that's stuck to the monitor of the PCs. Okay. If there's no way for a data subject to correct their data, remember, integrity means that the data is accurate. And if there's no way for your data subjects to express how they want to correct that data, then that would be a sign of negligence. As I said earlier, we have updated the Data Privacy Act for things like cloud. So sometimes when you will read the Data Privacy Act, you will see things like this. No data can be accessed from a location of government property. Wow, that's saying, so that means government cannot use cloud, right? But it says also, unless otherwise provided in guidelines to be issued by the Commission. And that's why we have issued circulars, like Circular 1601, which says a government can engage a service provider for storing personal data. And we recommend the standard ISO 27018 as the most appropriate certification. And by the way, the Department of ICT also recently issued Circular 2017-02, which really says that government can use cloud. And in fact, no, the ICT circular says cloud first, which means for any government agency that's implementing a new system in 2017, they have to think first of how they can put it in the cloud. Okay, and that's how forward-thinking the DICT is. 27,001, you may have heard of that already. 27,018 gives you additional benefits because basically in 27,001, you're storing data within your own data center. But 27,018, you're putting that data in someone else's data center, and so someone else's employees might be able to look at that data and sell that data. But if that service provider is 27,018 certified, that means that they give you control over which country your data will be stored in. They can assure you that your data won't be used for marketing or advertising unless you consent, and you'll be notified of legal requests for any data disclosure. Again, let me just skip over these. But this one is important, okay? Section 20 says that you must implement reasonable and appropriate measures. Who defines what is reasonable? Who defines what is appropriate, right? The National Privacy Commission gives that opportunity to sectoral groups to define their own measures of reasonable and appropriate. So we can say banking sector, if you want to define a privacy code for your industry, you can do so. And once you have done it, you can submit it to us for review and for comment. And ideally, you can base your privacy code on Circular 16-01. Because 16-01 is the privacy code for government agencies. So if the healthcare sector, the pharma sector, the real estate sector wants to come up with a privacy code, look at Circular 1601 and you can come up with your own. Number 4, legal obligation, you have to report the breach within 72 hours. It's there in the IRR and especially in the circular. And compliance looks like this. You have a data breach response team formed. And all of them know what they have to do when it comes to assessment, mitigation, notification, and recovery. And you conduct drills on a regular basis, maybe once, twice a year, just to make sure that everything's working. And of course, your service providers will also comply because they'll also notify you if they have been breached. And negligence looks like this: no team, no drills, no reports, no notification. By the way, no notification is already punishable by 18 months to 5 years of imprisonment and a fine of 500,000 to 1 million pesos. Okay? I mean, it's not easy to identify a breach, right? Sometimes there's a theft or a break-in. Maybe your server is stolen. And then it takes you 2 weeks to realize, hey, by the way, there was data on that server. Okay, then you have to report it. Okay? But it also means that you have to train your employees to think about data. So, hindi lang, nawala yung server, 40,000 pesos, sayang yung server na yon. It's what data was on that server. Okay? Flood, earthquake, hacking attacks, so all of these can be vectors for a data breach. And of course, your team should know what actions to take. And finally, the 5th obligation is to register with the NPC. We want to know what kind of data you're holding so that we can advise you on what sort of compliance actions to take. Registration should be up to date. It should include also your automated processing operations. And you should also have an annual report, by the way, registered with, that you report to the NPC. And of course, there's negligence if you don't even register or the registration is out of date. By the way, designating a DPO is the first step towards compliance. You cannot register your systems with the NPC unless you have a DPO. You cannot report your compliance activities unless you go through your DPO. So let me end here by saying the 5 to remember: the DPO, the privacy principles, the data protection, the breach reporting, and the systems registration. In closing, how can we help? Again, we're willing to deliver this message to top management. Invite us to your company get-togethers, or if you have your associations, we can also do this presentation. Visit our websites, because that's where we put up guidance on how to appoint a DPO, how to conduct the PIA. The website will be up next month, in late March. For now, you can go to our Facebook page. And also, at any time, you can send us an email at info@privacy.gov.ph, and hopefully we can answer your questions. As my last slide, I wanted to address what Dr. Yu said about being accountable. Because compliance is just doing what's required. Yeah, we did those 5 things that Dondi talked about. We're in compliance. Because you did what's required. But being accountable to the data subject who has entrusted their data to you means going beyond what's required. Means doing what's necessary. One example, when it comes to dental hygiene, yeah, sure, I comply with my dentist because I brush my teeth after every meal. But being accountable means I do what's needed. I floss. I visit my dentist regularly to make sure I have no activities and that my breath is fresh all the time. Right? So my last message to you is don't just comply, be accountable. Thank you.